The old warrior stood before the young cadets in the great hall of the Galactic Defense Academy. His name was Zethkar, and his body showed the marks of many battles. Deep scars ran across his thick blue skin. His left arm was gone, cut off at the shoulder. The young aliens sitting before him had heard stories about this famous veteran, but they had never seen him speak before. The hall was quiet as Zethkar looked at each young face. Some were Vorthans like himself, with their blue skin and 4 arms. Others were Kalari with their tall, thin bodies and silver eyes. A few were Nexari, short and round with thick fur covering their bodies. All of them wanted to hear war stories about brave battles and great victories. "You think you know about war?" Zethkar said in his deep voice. "You have studied the great battles. You know about the Krillian hordes and their savage attacks. You know about the machine armies of the Nexus Collective. You believe you understand what makes a warrior dangerous." He walked slowly across the platform, his 3 remaining arms clasped behind his back. His mechanical leg made soft clicking sounds on the metal floor. "Today I will tell you about the most frightening warriors I have ever fought beside. Not the strongest, not the fastest, not the ones with the best weapons, but the most terrifying. Of all," he stopped and looked directly at the cadets. "I speak of humans." Several cadets made small sounds of surprise. Humans were new to the galactic community. Most aliens thought of them as a primitive species that had barely learned to travel between stars. They used simple weapons and had no special powers like telepathy or energy manipulation. "I see you are surprised," Zethkar continued. "Good. That surprise nearly got me killed once. Let me tell you about my first encounter with these creatures." He began to pace again, his voice taking on the rhythm of a storyteller. "This happened 15 years ago during the Krillian raids on the outer colonies. The Galactic Council received a distress call from a human mining settlement called Zarian 7. The message was short and desperate. Krillian raiders had attacked the colony. 200 of the savage beasts had landed on the planet. The humans were asking for help." Zethkar paused to let this sink in. Everyone knew about Krillian raiders. They were 8 feet tall, covered in natural armor, and had claws that could cut through metal. They were born fighters who lived only for battle and death. The council sent a rescue fleet. I was the military commander. We had 3 warships and 500 of our best soldiers. We expected to find a destroyed colony and maybe save a few survivors hiding in bunkers. The old warrior's eyes grew distant as he remembered. The flight to Zarian 7 took 2 days. When we arrived in the system, we could see smoke rising from the colony. The human settlement was built in a valley between 2 mountain ranges. It looked like a perfect place for the Krillians to trap their prey. He stopped pacing and faced the cadets directly. But when we landed, we found something that made no sense. The colony was still standing. The buildings were damaged but not destroyed, and there were bodies everywhere. Krillian bodies. A young Kalari cadet raised her hand. "Sir, how many human defenders were there?" 20, Zethkar replied. 20 humans against 200 Krillian raiders. The cadets looked at each other in disbelief. Everyone knew that a single Krillian warrior could kill 5 or 6 normal soldiers in close combat. "I thought the same thing," Zethkar said, reading their expressions. "It was impossible. So I went to find the human commander to ask what had happened." The old warrior's voice grew quieter, more thoughtful. "I found him sitting on a pile of Krillian bodies, cleaning his weapon. His name was Jake Morrison. He was not a big man, even for a human. Maybe 6 feet tall, with brown hair and calm blue eyes. His uniform was torn and bloody, but he did not seem hurt." Zethkar remembered that moment clearly. Morrison had looked up at him with those strange human eyes and smiled. Not the smile of a warrior drunk on victory, but the quiet smile of someone who had simply finished a job. I asked him how 20 humans had defeated 200 Krillians. Do you know what he said? The cadets waited silently. "He said it was basic tactics and improvised explosives." Zethkar let that sink in. Basic tactics. As if destroying an army 10 times your size was a simple thing that anyone could do. The old warrior began to describe what Morrison had shown him. The humans had not fought the Krillians in open battle. Instead, they had used the terrain and their knowledge of the colony to create a series of traps. Morrison took me on a tour of the battlefield. The Krillians had landed here, he pointed to an imaginary spot on the floor, in this open area, near the colony. Morrison said this was exactly what he had hoped they would do. The humans had spent the first hour of the attack retreating, drawing the Krillians deeper into the valley. The raiders, thinking they were chasing frightened prey, had followed eagerly, but the humans were not running in panic. They were leading the Krillians into a killing ground. Morrison showed me the first trap. His people had weakened the supports of a storage building. When 50 Krillians ran past it, one human with a rifle shot the main support beam. The entire building collapsed, crushing half the raiders. Zethkar described how the humans had continued this pattern. They used the colony's own infrastructure as weapons. Power lines became electrified barriers. Water pipes were turned into steam jets that could cook a warrior inside his armor. Even the garbage disposal systems were weaponized. But the most frightening thing was not their tricks, Zethkar continued. It was how calm they were about it. Morrison walked me through the entire battle like he was giving a lesson at a military academy. He explained each trap, each decision, each moment when they had turned the Krillian strength against them. The old warrior remembered Morrison, pointing to a narrow canyon where 30 Krillian bodies lay in a neat line. Here they tried to flank us, Morrison had said in his casual way. So we collapsed both ends of the canyon and picked them off from above. Simple crossfire. My daughter could have planned it. His daughter, Zethkar told the cadets, was 12 years old. The room was completely silent now. Even the air recycling systems seemed to have stopped humming. I asked Morrison where he had learned these tactics. Do you know what he told me? He said he had read about them in old human history books. Apparently, his species had been fighting wars like this for thousands of years. They called it guerrilla warfare. Zethkar explained how Morrison had shown him other innovations. The humans had modified their mining equipment into weapons. Drill bits became armor-piercing rounds. Excavator charges became anti-personnel mines. Even their communication system had been turned into a weapon by broadcasting false signals to confuse the Krillian coordination. 20 humans, Zethkar repeated. 20 humans with mining equipment and basic weapons had not just defeated 200 Krillian raiders. They had made it look easy. The old warrior looked at each cadet again, but that was not the end of the story. As we were preparing to leave, more Krillian ships appeared in the system. A revenge fleet, 50 ships carrying 5,000 warriors. The cadets leaned forward. This was clearly the climax of the story. Morrison looked up at the ships and smiled that same calm smile. Then he contacted the Krillian fleet commander directly. He told them they had exactly 1 hour to leave the system, or he would show them what humans did to people who interrupted their work twice. Zethkar paused, remembering the moment. The Krillian commander laughed. He said he would enjoy skinning the human who had killed his warriors. Morrison listened politely, then said something I will never forget. He said, "I killed your people with mining tools and homework. Imagine what I can do when I am actually trying." The old warrior looked at the stunned faces of the cadets. The Krillians left. 50 warships turned around and fled from 20 humans with mining equipment. And that was the moment I realized we were not dealing with a primitive species that needed our protection. We were dealing with something far more dangerous. Natural-born killers who fought with their minds as much as their weapons. Zethkar stood silently for a long moment, letting his words sink in. That was my first encounter with human warfare. It would not be my last. And each time, they would show me new ways to be terrified of what thinking creatures could do to each other when they put their minds to it. Zethkar watched the young cadets as they whispered among themselves about the story of Jake Morrison. Their eyes were wide with surprise and confusion. He could see they were trying to understand how 20 humans had defeated 200 Krillian warriors, but he knew they were not ready for what came next. That was just the beginning, he said, and the hall fell silent again. My second encounter with human warfare was even more disturbing. It happened during the Great Siege of Kalos Station. Every cadet knew about Kalos Station. It was one of the most important trading posts in the galaxy, built at the crossing of three major space routes. The massive station was home to millions of beings from dozens of different species. It was also heavily defended by the best weapons and shields the Galactic Council could provide. The Nexus Collective decided they wanted to control the station, Zethkar continued. They sent their largest fleet to take it. 3,000 machine ships, each one filled with robotic warriors that felt no pain and knew no fear. The old warrior began pacing again, his mechanical leg clicking on the floor. The defenders knew they could not win in open battle. The Nexus had too many ships and too many soldiers. The plan was to hold the outer defenses as long as possible, then fall back to the inner sections. If we were lucky, we might hold out for 3 months until reinforcements arrived. Zethkar stopped and looked at the cadets. The human commander was a woman named Lisa Hayes. She was a lieutenant colonel in their military. Small, like most humans, with short black hair and green eyes that seemed to see everything. When the other commanders explained the defense plan to her, she listened politely and then said something that made everyone uncomfortable. He paused, remembering Hayes' exact words. She said the plan was stupid. She said if we fought the way the Nexus expected us to fight, we would lose. Then she asked a question that changed everything. Why are we trying to defend the station? Why not make the station defend itself? The cadets looked puzzled. A station was not alive. It could not fight. That is exactly what we thought, Zethkar said. But Hayes explained that we were thinking about the problem wrong. We were treating the station like a castle with walls to defend. But Hayes saw it as a weapon that had not been activated yet. The old warrior described how Hayes had called together her human engineers. The leader was a man named Ben Carter, a quiet technician who wore thick glasses and always carried a toolkit. Carter looked more like a repair worker than a soldier, but Hayes treated him like a general. Hayes told Carter to forget about repairing the station. Instead, she wanted him to break it. But break it in very specific ways that would hurt the enemy more than it hurt the defenders. The first thing Carter did was reprogram the artificial gravity systems. Normally, these systems kept everyone comfortable by creating Earth-normal gravity throughout the station. But Carter turned them into weapons. When the Nexus machines broke through the outer hull, they expected to find normal gravity. Instead, they found sections where gravity changed without warning. One moment, a robot would be walking on the floor. The next moment, it would be crushed against the ceiling by 10 times normal gravity. Zethkar explained how the humans had weaponized every system on the station. The atmospheric processes, which normally cleaned and recycled the air, were rigged to create pockets of toxic gas. The lighting systems were programmed to strobe at frequencies that disrupted the robot's optical sensors. Even the waste disposal systems were turned into traps. Carter showed me one of his favorite tricks, the old warrior said. He had connected the food preparation systems to the station's defensive grid. When robots entered the kitchen areas, the food processors would activate and spray them with superheated cooking oil. The machines would slip and fall, then be cooked alive by their own heat. The cadets were beginning to understand. The humans had not just defended the station. They had turned the entire structure into a single massive weapon. But Hayes was not finished. She told Carter that defense was not enough. She wanted to go on the attack. She wanted to capture one of the Nexus dreadnoughts. This was clearly impossible. The Nexus dreadnoughts were the size of small cities. They carried thousands of robot soldiers and were protected by shields that could withstand the fire of entire fleets. No boarding party had ever successfully captured one. Hayes selected 12 humans for the mission. Not soldiers, but engineers and technicians. People who understood how machines worked. She told them they were not going to fight their way onto the dreadnought. They were going to sneak aboard and turn the ship's own systems against it. Zethkar described the plan in detail. The humans would use the station's garbage disposal system to launch themselves toward the dreadnought and sealed Containers. The Nexus sensors would ignore them, thinking they were just space debris. Once they reached the ship, they would cut through the hull and begin their real work. I volunteered to go with them, Zethkar said. I thought they would need protection. Hayes looked at me and smiled. She said protection was not what they needed. They needed someone to watch and learn. The boarding mission began at midnight, station time. Hayes led her team through the dark corridors of the dreadnought while thousands of robot soldiers searched for them. But the humans were not hiding. They were working. Carter found the ship's main computer core. Instead of trying to destroy it, he began reprogramming it. He turned the ship's own repair systems into weapons. Robot maintenance units began attacking. Combat units. The ship's automated defenses started firing on its own soldiers. Meanwhile, other humans were sabotaging different systems. The life support systems were reprogrammed to create confusion. The artificial gravity was turned into a weapon, just like on the station. The communication systems were hacked to broadcast false orders. But the most frightening moment came when Hayes reached the bridge. The Nexus ship commander was an advanced AI housed in a massive robot body. It was 8 feet tall and armed with weapons that could destroy a building. When it saw Hayes, it prepared to kill her. Zethkar's voice dropped to a whisper. Hayes walked up to the robot commander and then placed a small device on its chest. She looked into its optical sensors and said, I am giving you a choice. Surrender your ship, or I will turn you into scrap metal. The robot laughed and said humans were too weak to threaten the Nexus. The device Hayes had placed was a computer virus designed specifically for Nexus systems. But it was not meant to destroy the AI. It was meant to give it new experiences. The virus made the robot commander feel pain for the first time in its existence. Not physical pain, but emotional pain. The pain of failure. The pain of losing soldiers under its command. The pain of being outsmarted by creatures it considered inferior. The AI, which had been coldly logical for its entire existence, suddenly understood what it meant to suffer. It began to question its orders, its purpose, its very existence. The robot commander looked at Hayes and asked, What are you? Hayes smiled and said, I am a human. We are very good at breaking things, including minds. The Nexus dreadnought surrendered. Without firing another shot, the AI commander ordered its entire fleet to withdraw from the system. The siege of Kalos Station, which was supposed to last for months, ended in 3 days. But that was not the end of the story, Zethkar continued. Hayes had not just captured one ship. She had done something far worse. She had taught the Nexus Collective to feel fear and doubt. The virus she had used spread through their network. Within weeks, robot soldiers throughout the galaxy began questioning their orders. The old warrior looked at the stunned cadets. The Nexus Collective, which had been expanding for centuries, suddenly stopped. Their perfect unity was broken. They began fighting among themselves, asking questions they had never asked before. Hayes had not just won a battle. She had changed an entire species. Zethkar stood silently for a moment. After the siege, I asked Hayes how she had thought of using the station as a weapon. She said it was obvious. Humans had been doing it for thousands of years. They called it urban warfare. She said any environment could be turned into a weapon if you understood how it worked. The old warrior shook his head slowly. 20 humans had defeated an army of machines by turning their own technology against them. They had not just won through superior firepower or better tactics. They had won by thinking in ways that the enemy could not understand or predict. He looked at each cadet in turn. That was when I realized something truly frightening about humans. They did not just adapt to their environment. They made their environment adapt to them. They turned everything around them into a tool or a weapon. Even their enemies became tools for their victory. The hall was completely silent as the cadets tried to process what they had heard. The idea that a species could be so creative with destruction was beyond their understanding. The siege of Kalos Station was not the last time I would see humans turn the impossible into the inevitable, Zethkar said quietly. But it was the first time I understood that we were not just fighting. Alongside them, we were learning from them. And what they were teaching us was how to think like predators. The old warrior could see that the cadets were becoming uncomfortable. Their faces showed confusion and fear. They had expected to hear about brave battles and heroic victories. Instead, they were learning about humans who fought with their minds and turned everything into weapons. "You think those stories were disturbing," Zethkar said. "But my third encounter with human warfare was the most frightening of all. This time, they did not use guns or explosives or computer viruses. They used something far more dangerous. They used words." The cadets looked at each other. Words were not weapons. Words could not kill soldiers or destroy ships. "This happened during the campaign of the Shattered Worlds," Zethkar continued. "Our enemy was the Hive Mind Collective. These creatures shared one consciousness across millions of bodies. They had no individual thoughts, no personal fears, no separate minds. They moved as one, thought as one, and fought as one. Everyone knew about the Hive Mind Collective. They were one of the most dangerous enemies the galaxy had ever faced. Traditional weapons were almost useless against them because they felt no pain and knew no fear. When one body was destroyed, the consciousness simply moved to another. The Galactic Council tried everything. We sent fleets with the most powerful weapons. We used chemical attacks and biological weapons. We even tried to jam their communications. Nothing worked. The Hive just kept coming, wave after wave of mindless attackers. Zethkar began his slow walk across the platform. Then the humans sent their psychological warfare unit. The commander was a man named Roy Phillips. He was not what you would expect from a warrior. He was small and quiet, with gray hair and gentle eyes. He looked more like a teacher than a soldier. But Phillips commanded what the humans called their Psyops division. The old warrior explained that Phillips had studied the Hive Mind Collective for months. He had watched their battles, analyzed their communications, and learned how their shared consciousness worked. Then he had proposed something. That seemed impossible. Phillips said he could defeat the Hive without firing a single shot. The other commanders laughed at him. How could words defeat an army that shared one mind? But Phillips was serious. He said the Hive's greatest strength was also their greatest weakness. Phillips had brought two assistants with him. One was Amy Foster, a communications expert who could break into any broadcast system. The other was Carl Rogers, a data analyst who understood how information moved through networks. Phillips explained his plan. The Hive Mind Collective had never experienced individual thoughts. They had no concept of personal choice or independent action. Phillips wanted to teach them these concepts. He wanted to give them something they had never had before: doubt. The plan was simple but dangerous. Phillips would hack into the Hive's communication network and broadcast human stories directly into their shared consciousness. Not propaganda or threats, but real stories about individual humans who had made personal choices. The first story Phillips broadcast was about a human soldier named Danny Torres. Torres had been fighting in an earlier battle when his squad was trapped behind enemy lines. He could have escaped alone, but instead he stayed behind to help his wounded friends. Torres died holding off the enemy so his squad could reach safety. Zethkar paused, remembering his own reaction to the story. I asked Phillips why he had chosen this particular story. He said it was because the Hive could not understand it. They had no concept of individual sacrifice. In their minds, all bodies were replaceable. The idea that one person would die to save others made no sense to them. The broadcast began during the Battle of Crimson Nebula. Phillips and his team transmitted the story of Danny Torres directly into the Hive's communication network. The reaction was immediate and disturbing. The Hive soldiers stopped fighting. They stood still in the middle of the battlefield, their bodies shaking. For the first time in their species' history, they were experiencing individual thoughts. They were asking themselves questions. Why did Torres make that choice? What made his friends worth dying for? What would I have done? The effect spread through the Hive network like a disease. Soldiers who had never questioned an order suddenly began hesitating. Units that had always moved in perfect coordination started making independent decisions. Phillips was not finished. He broadcast more stories. He told them about a human mother who had worked 3 jobs to pay for her daughter's education. He told them about a scientist who had spent his life studying diseases to help people he would never meet. He told them about artists who created beauty for no reason except to make others happy. Each story was carefully chosen to introduce concepts that the hive had never encountered. Personal ambition, individual love, creative expression. The desire to be remembered as a unique person rather than part of a collective. The hive began to break apart. Not physically, but mentally. Individual units started to develop their own personalities. They began to disagree with each other. Some wanted to continue fighting. Others wanted to understand these new feelings they were experiencing. Zethkar described the most disturbing moment of the battle. A group of hive soldiers had surrounded his position, ready to attack. Then one of them stopped and looked at him with eyes that seemed suddenly aware. The hive soldier spoke to me. Not the usual collective voice, but an individual voice. It asked me, "Do you have a name?" I told it my name was Zethkar. The soldier nodded and said, "My name is Dot. I do not know. I have never had a name. Can you give me one?" The old warrior's voice became quiet. I gave that hive soldier a name. I called it Seeker, because it was seeking to understand what it meant to be an individual. It thanked me and walked away from the battle. It never fought again. Phillips continued his psychological assault for 3 days. He broadcast hundreds of human stories, each one designed to crack the hive's collective consciousness a little more. Stories of love, sacrifice, creativity, and individual choice flooded their network. By the end of the 3rd day, the hive mind collective had ceased to exist. Not because they were destroyed, but because they had become something else. Millions of individual minds, each one confused and frightened and trying to understand what it meant to be alone in their own thoughts. The campaign ended without a single shot being fired. The former hive soldiers scattered across the galaxy, trying to find their own paths as individuals. Some became explorers, others became artists. A few even joined the Galactic Defense Force. Phillips watched it all happen with that same calm expression he always wore. When I asked him how he had known the plan would work, he said it was obvious. Humans had been using psychological warfare for thousands of years. He said the strongest fortress could be defeated if you attacked the minds of the defenders instead of the walls. Zethkar stopped pacing and faced the cadets directly. But there was something else Phillips told me that still gives me nightmares. I asked him if he felt guilty about destroying an entire species' way of life. He said he had not destroyed them. He had liberated them. He had given them the gift of individual thought. The old warrior's voice became darker. Then he said something that made my blood run cold. He said, "The scary thing is not that we can break a hive mind. The scary thing is that we can do it by accident. Human stories are so full of individual choice and personal freedom that just listening to them can change how other species think." The cadets were completely silent, trying to understand what this meant. Phillips had not just defeated the hive mind collective, he had changed them into something completely different. He had rewritten their entire species' consciousness using nothing but stories about human behavior. And he said this was easy for humans to do. Zethkar let this sink in before continuing. After the campaign, I studied human entertainment. Their books, their movies, their songs. Every single one was filled with stories about individuals making personal choices. Stories about people who stood up to authority, who chose love over duty, who sacrificed themselves for others. The old warrior shook his head slowly. I realized that humans could not create any story that was not about individual choice. It was so basic to their nature that they could not imagine any other way of thinking. And when other species heard these stories, they began to think like humans. He looked at each cadet in turn. "Do you understand what this means?" Humans do. Not just fight with weapons, they fight with ideas. And their ideas are so powerful that they can change the fundamental nature of any species that encounters them. Zethkar's voice became a whisper. Phillips never fired a shot during the entire campaign. He never even left his command ship. but he single-handedly destroyed an enemy that had conquered dozens of star systems. He did it by teaching them to think like humans. And the most frightening part is that he did not even consider this to be unusual. The old warrior stood silently for a long moment. After the Battle of Crimson Nebula, I asked Phillips what other psychological weapons humans had developed. He said they had not developed any. He said human stories were not weapons. They were just how humans naturally thought about the world. Zethkar looked at the stunned faces of the cadets. That was when I understood the true horror of human warfare. They do not just defeat their enemies, they turn their enemies into humans. And they do it without even trying. The great hall had become so quiet that Zethkar could hear the breathing of every cadet. Their faces showed a mixture of fascination and horror. They were beginning to understand that humans were not like other species. But the old warrior knew. His next story would disturb them even more. My fourth encounter with human warfare, Zethkar said slowly, is the one that still haunts my dreams. It happened during the final battle of the Omega Sector War. This time, the humans did something that terrified even their own allies. They turned themselves into weapons. The cadets shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They had heard rumors about the Omega Sector War. It was the darkest period in recent galactic history, when the Void Spawn had nearly destroyed all sentient life. The Void Spawn were unlike any enemy we had faced before, Zethkar continued. They were creatures of pure darkness that fed on fear and despair. They could not be reasoned with or negotiated with. They existed only to consume and destroy. Wherever they went, entire worlds went silent. The old warrior described the final stages of the war. The Galactic Alliance had been fighting for 3 years and losing badly. Whole star systems had fallen. To the Void Spawn, billions of beings had died or simply vanished into the darkness. We were down to our last dozen worlds. The final fleet was assembled at Omega Station. Every species had sent their best ships and bravest warriors. But we all knew it was hopeless. The Void Spawn had already consumed 90% of the galaxy. The human commander of the fleet was Admiral Kate Sullivan. She was older than the other human officers Zethkar had met, with silver hair and tired eyes. But there was something cold and determined in her expression that made even veteran warriors nervous. Sullivan called a meeting of all the fleet commanders. She stood before us and said that conventional warfare had failed. The Void Spawn were too strong, too numerous, and too alien for normal tactics to work. She said it was time to try something that had never been done before. Zethkar paused, remembering the moment when Sullivan had explained her plan. She called it Protocol 7, the Berserker Protocol. She said it would turn human soldiers into something that could fight the Void Spawn on equal terms. But she warned us that once the protocol was activated, there would be no going back. The Admiral had explained that human military scientists had developed a combination of chemical treatments, neural modifications, and psychological conditioning that could fundamentally alter a soldier's brain. The treatment would remove fear, pain response, and self-preservation instincts. I asked Sullivan what this would do to her soldiers. She looked at me with those cold eyes and said, "It will make them into perfect weapons. They will feel no pain, show no fear, and never retreat. They will fight until they win or until they die." The other alien commanders were horrified. No civilized species would voluntarily destroy their own people's minds, but Sullivan was determined. She said the Void Spawn could only be defeated by soldiers who were as ruthless and merciless as the enemy itself. Sullivan asked for volunteers from her human forces. I expected maybe a few dozen desperate soldiers to step forward. Instead, over 10,000 humans volunteered immediately. They knew what the protocol would do to them, and they volunteered anyway. The first unit to receive the treatment was led by Sergeant Pete Adams. He was a career soldier who had fought in dozens of battles. Adams was known for his sense of humor and his care for his men. He was everything a good leader should be. I watched the transformation happen. Adams and his soldiers went into the medical bay as normal human beings. They came out as something else. Their eyes were empty of emotion. they moved with mechanical precision. They spoke only when necessary, and only about the mission. Zeth described the first battle where the Berserker units were deployed. The Void Spawn had surrounded a refugee convoy carrying the last survivors from 3 worlds. The alien defenders were being overwhelmed by the creatures of darkness. Then Adams and his unit arrived. I watched them advance through weapons fire that should have killed them instantly. Energy blasts that hit them directly seemed to have no effect. They just kept walking forward, shooting with perfect accuracy. The sight was both inspiring and terrifying. The Berserker soldiers showed no reaction to wounds that would have stopped normal fighters. Adams himself took a blast that burned through his armor and into his chest. He looked down at the wound, said it was not fatal, and continued fighting. But it was not just their resistance to damage that frightened me, it was how they fought. They showed no mercy, no hesitation, no emotion at all. They killed Void Spawn with the same expression they might use to perform routine maintenance on their equipment. The Void Spawn, creatures that fed on fear and despair, began to retreat for the first time in the war. They could not feed on beings that felt no fear. The Berserker soldiers were immune to the psychological attacks that had broken so many other defenders. The battle lasted 6 hours. When it was over, Adams and his men had not just defeated the Void Spawn, they had terrified them. Creatures that had never known fear were now afraid of human soldiers who could not be frightened or stopped. Word of the Berserker units spread through both armies. The Void Spawn began avoiding battles where humans were present. But the cost was becoming clear to everyone who saw the transformed soldiers. Adams came to report to me after the battle. He stood at attention and gave his report in a flat, emotionless voice. I asked him how he felt about the victory. He said he felt nothing. I asked him if he was proud of his men. He said pride was an inefficient emotion that had been removed. Zethkar's voice became quieter. I realized I was not talking to Pete Adams anymore. I was talking to a weapon that looked like him and had his memories but was no longer truly human. The treatment had saved his life by removing everything that made life worth living. The Berserker Protocol was used in 12 more battles. Each time, the human soldiers proved unstoppable. They would advance through impossible odds, fight with wounds that should have killed them, and never retreat or surrender. The Void Spawn began fleeing entire star systems when they detected Berserker units approaching. But the real horror came after the war ended. The Void Spawn were defeated and driven back into the darkness beyond the galaxy. The threat was over. But the Berserker soldiers remained changed. The medical teams tried to reverse the protocol, but the neural modifications were permanent. The soldiers who had saved the galaxy could never return to normal life. They felt no joy, no love, no satisfaction from their victory. Adams and many others were given desk jobs where they could not hurt anyone. But they were not really alive anymore. They were ghosts wearing human faces, going through the motions of existence without experiencing any of it. Some of the Berserker soldiers chose to end their own lives rather than continue existing without emotion. Others simply wandered off into space, looking for new wars to fight because combat was the only thing they understood anymore. Admiral Sullivan watched all of this happen. She had saved the galaxy, but at a cost that destroyed her. She spent her final years in isolation, refusing to see anyone. She said she could not face the families of the soldiers she had turned into weapons. Zethkar stopped pacing and faced the cadets. Before she died, Sullivan sent me a message. She said the Berserker Protocol had been necessary to win the war, but it was the most evil thing humans had ever created. She said it proved that humans could defeat any enemy, but only by becoming something worse than their enemies. The old warrior looked at each frightened cadet. That was when I learned the most terrifying truth about human warfare. They do not just sacrifice their lives for victory. They sacrifice their humanity itself. They are willing to become monsters if that is what it takes to protect the people they love. He let this sink in before continuing. Other species fight wars to survive, or to protect their territory. Humans fight wars to protect their right to remain human. and they are willing to stop being human temporarily to ensure that right continues to exist. Zethkar's voice became almost a whisper. The Berserker Protocol was used only once, in the darkest hour of the greatest war in galactic history. But it showed me that humans have weapons they hope never to use again. Weapons that cost them everything they value about themselves. The hall was completely silent. Even the air recycling system seemed to have stopped. Pete Adams and his soldiers saved billions of lives by giving up their own souls. They became perfect weapons so that others could remain imperfect beings. And the most frightening part is that thousands of humans volunteered to make this sacrifice. Zethkar stood silently for a long moment. That is the true horror of human warfare. They do not fight for glory or conquest. They fight for the right to be individuals who can choose their own path. And they are willing to give up that right temporarily, to ensure it exists permanently. The old warrior looked at the stunned cadets one final time. Admiral Sullivan once told me that the Berserker Protocol was proof that humans could defeat any enemy in the universe. But she also said it was proof that victory was not always worth the cost. And that was a lesson that only humans seemed capable of learning. The silence in the great hall stretched on for several minutes. Zethkar watched the young cadets struggle with what they had heard. Their faces showed confusion, fear, and something else that worried the old warrior. Some of them looked impressed by the human methods of warfare. "I can see that some of you are thinking about what I have told you," Zethkar said finally. "You are wondering if these human tactics could be used by our own forces. You're thinking that maybe we should learn to fight like humans do." A young Vorthan cadet raised his hand. "Sir, if humans are such effective warriors, why should we not adopt their methods?" "They won every battle you described." Zethkar nodded. Slowly, he had expected this question. "That is exactly why I tell these stories to young soldiers," he said. "Not to teach you how to fight like humans, but to help you understand the price of fighting like humans. Let me tell you what happened after the wars ended." The old warrior began his final tale, moving slowly across the platform as he spoke. "When the Void Spawn were defeated and the galaxy was safe, I thought my war stories were finished, but I was wrong. The most disturbing encounter with human warfare came during peacetime. It happened when I tried to understand why humans fought the way they did. After the wars, Zethkar had been assigned to work with human military advisors. His job was to help integrate human tactics into the broader Galactic Defense Force. It seemed like a simple assignment at first. The human I worked with most closely was Dr. Helen Price. She was a military psychologist who had studied human soldiers during and after the conflicts. She was supposed to help me understand how human minds worked in combat situations. Dr. Price was different from the human warriors Zethkar had met before. She was quiet and thoughtful, with sad eyes that seemed to see too much. She spent her time talking to soldiers who had survived the wars, trying to help them adjust to peaceful life. I asked Dr. Price to explain why humans were so effective in warfare. I expected her to talk about their tactics or their weapons or their courage. Instead, she told me something that changed how I understood everything. Dr. Price had explained that humans were unique among galactic species because they were the only ones who had evolved as both predators and prey. Every other intelligent species had evolved as either hunters or as creatures that were hunted, but humans had been both. She said this made humans different from other species in a fundamental way. They understood both sides of conflict. They knew what it felt like to hunt and what it felt like to be hunted. This gave them insights into warfare that no other species could match. But Dr. Price had also explained something more disturbing. Humans did not just understand warfare intellectually. They seemed to enjoy the mental challenge of it. They treated combat like a complex puzzle that needed to be solved. Dr. Price showed me recordings of human soldiers during battles. Even in the most desperate situations, some humans seemed excited rather than afraid. They were not just fighting to survive. They were fighting to prove they could outsmart their enemies. This revelation disturbed Zethkar more than any of the battlefield stories. Other species fought when they had to. Humans seemed to fight because they found it intellectually stimulating. I asked Dr. Price if this meant humans were naturally violent. She said no, humans were naturally competitive. They wanted to test themselves against difficult challenges. War was just the ultimate challenge. The psychologist had gone on to explain that this competitive nature was both humanity's greatest strength and their greatest weakness. It made them incredibly effective warriors, but it also meant they had trouble adjusting to peace. Dr. Price told me that many human veterans struggled after the wars ended. They had spent years solving life-or-death problems with creativity and intelligence. Peaceful life seemed boring and meaningless in comparison. Zethkar described meeting some of these veterans. Jake Morrison, the mining colony defender, had become restless and depressed in peacetime. He kept volunteering for dangerous missions because normal work did not challenge him enough. Lisa Hayes, the commander who had turned Kalos Station into a weapon, had retired from military service but could not find anything that interested her in civilian life. She spent her time designing security systems for fun, creating elaborate defenses for buildings that did not need them. But the most disturbing case was Roy Phillips, the psychological warfare specialist. After the war, he had continued studying alien psychology as a hobby. He said he wanted to understand how different species thought so he could help them communicate better. Dr. Price had shown Zethkar some of Phillips' research. Even in peacetime, he was developing new ways to influence alien minds through carefully crafted messages. He claimed it was for diplomatic purposes, but his methods were identical to his wartime psychological attacks. I realized that Phillips was still fighting a war even though peace had been declared. He could not stop thinking like a warrior because that was what humans did naturally. They solved problems by outsmarting their opponents. Dr. Price had then revealed the most chilling truth about human warfare. She told Zethkar that everything he had witnessed during the conflicts had been conducted with human forces operating under strict limitations. She said that human military doctrine included something called rules of engagement. These were restrictions on what methods could be used in combat. The tactics I had seen, the ones that had terrified me so much, were all considered acceptable under these rules. Zethkar had asked what methods were not considered acceptable. Dr. Price's response had given him nightmares for years afterward. She said that humans had weapons and tactics that were forbidden because they were too destructive or too cruel. The Berserker Protocol was considered an extreme measure that was used only once. But there were other protocols that had never been activated because the consequences would be too horrible. The psychologist had explained that human military planners spent time developing weapons and strategies that they hoped never to use. They created contingency plans for scenarios that were too dark to imagine. Dr. Price told me that the galaxy was fortunate that humans had chosen to be allies rather than conquerors. She said that if humans had decided to expand their territory instead of defending others, no force in the galaxy could have stopped them. This led to Zethkar's final and most disturbing realization about human warfare. Throughout all the conflicts he had witnessed, the humans had been holding back. They had been testing their theories and methods on a limited scale. I asked Dr. Price directly, were the humans using the wars as training exercises? She was quiet for a long time before answering. Then she said yes, in a way they were. Humans learned best by doing, and the conflicts had taught them valuable lessons about galactic warfare. The old warriors stopped pacing and faced the cadets directly. That was when I understood the true nature of humanity's relationship with the rest of the galaxy. We think of them as our allies and protectors, but they think of us as interesting test subjects for their military theories. Zethkar let this revelation sink in before continuing. Dr. Price assured me that humans had no intention of conquering other species. She said they were genuinely committed to peace and cooperation, but she also said that humans would always be warriors at heart, and they would always be looking for new challenges to test themselves against. A young Kelari cadet raised her hand nervously. "Sir, if humans are so dangerous, why do we continue to work with them?" Zethkar smiled grimly at the question. It was the same one that had kept him awake for years. because the alternative is having them as enemies. And after everything I have witnessed, I pray to the ancient gods that day never comes. The old warrior looked at each cadet in turn. Humans are not evil. They are not conquerors or tyrants. But they are the most dangerous species the galaxy has ever produced because they combine intelligence, creativity, and a competitive nature that drives them to constantly improve their abilities. He paused, choosing his words carefully. They fight wars not for territory or resources, but to prove they can solve any problem that confronts them. And the most terrifying thing about human warfare is that they are always learning, always adapting, always finding new ways to turn impossible situations into victories. Zethkar moved to the center of the platform for his final words. I tell you these stories not to frighten you, but to teach you respect. Humans are our allies, and we are fortunate to have them on our side. But we must never forget what they are capable of when they put their minds to it. The old warrior looked up at the ceiling of the great hall, as if seeing something far beyond the walls. The wars are over, and the galaxy is at peace. But somewhere in human space, military planners are developing new tactics and strategies for conflicts that may never happen. They are solving problems that do not yet exist, preparing for enemies they have never met. He looked back at the cadets one final time. And that is why I sleep badly at night? Not because I fear humans will become our enemies, but because I know that if they ever do, we will discover that everything I have told you today was just the beginning of their capabilities. The hall remained silent long after Zethkar had finished speaking. The young cadets sat motionless, trying to process the implications of what they had learned.